Hopefully you enjoyed that elevator music there. Um, Welcome to the special August forum here. This is a rescheduled forum from May, so we're really excited that we were able to squeeze this in. I've got a quick couple of intro slides, and then I'll turn it over to the main event here. But of course, this is a forum about Robin Creek Watershed and a whole bunch of things involving that. So we'll dive into that in just a moment. If you're not familiar with us, the hosts of this forum, we are partners of Scott County Watersheds. We are a nonprofit organization based out of Scott County, Iowa, dedicated to improving the health and stewardship of our watersheds. And one of the ways that we do that is through educational forums like this one, where we bring in some pretty cool folks to talk about some exciting work that's going on. So we have just a few quick Zoom housekeeping things. This presentation will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube page. So if you have to dip out for some reason or you want to refer back to it sometime, we have that available for you. If you have any questions throughout, please enter those in the Q&A box at the bottom. And if you have any technical questions, send that in the chat and change the recipient to ATEC, our webinar facilitator there, and they can help you out. And we'll spend some time at the end doing questions. Along with this forum, we have some other upcoming events and ways to get involved and make a difference in our watersheds. So we've got a paddle cleanup this weekend, good excuse to get out on a kayak or a canoe and get out there and make our river a little bit nicer. We also have our first in-person forum of the year later this month, a cleanup that we are hosting, but wanted to shout out our friends at Bettendorf Conservation Committee. They're hosting a cleanup on Duck Creek. And then looking forward to next month, we'll be hosting a creek cleanup in LeClaire. So lots of exciting ways to get involved. And all of this is available on partnersofscottcountywatersheds.org. You can find out more information there. And of course, these things would not be possible without our partners. These are our funding partners, and we'll kind of explain a little bit later. We have lots of project partners as well, including our speakers today, but we really couldn't do this without the people that fund our work. So thank you for those who are representing these organizations and watching today. And you can become one of these partners as well. So we offer many different ways to be involved. And again, all of this information and a better breakdown of it is available on our website. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our speakers here. So Michael and Kevin, I'll let you guys chat away and just tell me when you want me to move on with the slides.
So, yeah, all right. Thanks, Kelsey. So I'm Professor Michael Reisner. I'm the director of the Upper Mississippi Center at Augustana College. And we have Dr. Kevin Geedy, who's joining us as well. He's an ecologist that worked on the project. And you'll see a bunch of student names following the title. So we are subbing in for the students. So this was originally supposed to be a student presentation. So we'll do the best to make sure we accurately portray their findings from their research project. Next slide. So this project was conducted in partnership with the Upper Mississippi Center for Sustainable Communities. And our vision is to really mobilize Augustana's resources, so that our faculty and our students, and to help community partners tackle some of the sustainability challenges they're facing. In this context, we were really focusing in on a watershed. So the next slide. And, this project was completed as one of our Sustainable Working Landscapes Initiatives projects. So what this initiative does is it creates a one or a multi-year partnership between Augustana, in this case, it was Scott County Watershed Partnerships and the city of Davenport. And what we do is we then take a combination of courses, or we will use student research projects. And we try to tackle these projects that are proposed by community partners over the course of a year or more. The really nice part about this initiative is it gives the students an opportunity to try to apply the knowledge and the skills and the methods they've learned in their courses to a real world problem in their community. And then from the city's perspective, it helps them advance some of their initiatives that they might not otherwise be able to get to. So this watershed assessment was part of that larger initiative. So next slide. So a little introduction to Robin Creek Watershed. For many of you are probably familiar with it. So just to orient you, if you look across the bottom of the photo where it says R1, that's Duck Creek is going across. And you'll see, if you look at, this is the delineated watershed. So if you look, you'll see R1, R2, R3, and R4. Those are water quality monitoring sites that we set up in partnership with the city of Davenport. A couple of those include some historic monitoring sites by the Department of Natural Resources or the Snapshot program and or the city's monitoring program. So you'll see Rock Island 1 is just upstream of its confluence with Duck Creek. Rock Island 2 is just below Locust Avenue. Rock Island 3 is in the park, and Rock Island 4 is literally in some yards of a neighborhood just north and west of the park. So that kind of orients you to where we're looking at. The lower watershed is very really tightly dense urban development, and then you kind of go through a commercial retail zone along Locust, and then you get into a really nice area of green space with more moderate density housing. And then as you get up to actually R4, the houses even get lower density as you get into kind of some more of the suburban area. So that's kind of an overview of the watershed. So next slide. So this slide is the same. And what you're looking at is some land cover data that's showing the amount of impervious surface. And if you orient yourself, you'll see the darker red is where your impervious surface is approaching 60% in a given 30 meter by 30 meter parcel. And then when you get into the greener shades, which you can see in the park, obviously you have a lot less impervious surface. Green is actually less than 3% impervious surface. This is a nice overview of, looking at where the urban landscape is compared to some of the natural areas in green space. So this just gives you a feel for what's going on in the watershed. Pretty high amount of impervious surface, kind of on the north in the headwaters of the watershed, and then a fair amount of impervious surface as you get down towards the confluence with Duck Creek. So next slide. So this is, we are still in the initial stages of assessing the water quality of this watershed. This is kind of an average of the city's data and the data we've collected, which is limited to last year and this summer. So it's not a huge data set for some of these parameters, but if you look at this, I think it shows you a nice snapshot of the range of water quality in this stream varies quite a lot, even in the small between Robin 1 and Robin 4. So Robin 1, remember, is the confluence with Duck Creek. 2 is Locust Creek, 3 is in the park, and 4 is in the neighborhood just north and west of the park. You can see that at sites 1 and 3, the dissolved oxygen levels are really good. The total dissolved solids, kind of an overall level of what's in the stream, are also low. Ammonia and nitrate are extremely low. Phosphorus levels are pretty high in these reaches. And then biological oxygen demand, which is kind of a function of the bacteria decomposition, are really unremarkable and kind of an anomaly across the city of Davenport and these watersheds. At these two sites, 1 and 3, you'll see that total fecal coliforms and total E. coli are actually really low. Now, as you move your way up, site 2 there by Locust, things change dramatically over about a quarter mile. The dissolved oxygen drops to like 46%. So you got a reduction of over a half. The total dissolved solids more than double. Ammonia levels go up. Nitrate's still not an issue. Phosphorus levels actually drop. but then the biological oxygen demand goes up above 3, and you'll see you have tremendous levels of both fecal coliforms and E. coli. And then when you get to Robin 4, you'll see it's kind of in between site 2 and 1 and 3. So that's kind of a snapshot of the water quality data. And from there, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Geedy for a little bit to talk about kind of the assessment of the riparian zone. Next slide.
So this is, as Michael said, this is student work that we're reporting from a senior capstone class in environmental studies last year. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So what the students were interested in this class is the health of the riparian forests alongside Robin Creek. And one of the things that the students learned as they went through the class was that urbanization can have various different negative effects on streams, can change flooding, can change biodiversity, can change the amount of water pollution coming in from storm drain systems, et cetera. And that riparian forests can play a very important role in maintaining ecosystem services by buffering the stream from pollutants and erosion control, et cetera. One of the things the students settled on that they really wanted to understand that semester was the resilience of the Robin Creek watershed, especially with respect to the urban forest systems. Next slide, please. So we measured several different kinds of variables along Robin Creek. We looked at land cover and land use. We looked at the species diversity with respect to forest trees. We were focusing really primarily on forest trees. And then we looked at something that may be not as familiar to most folks, and that's functional diversity. Functional diversity is a way of looking at biological diversity that is beyond just species diversity. So functional diversity breaks species into functional groups and then measures the abundance of those functional groups. Well, what does that mean? Let's use a non-biological example. Suppose you were developing a team to work on some project at work, whatever your work happens to be. Well, if everyone on that team has the same skill set, maybe everybody's a really good writer, but maybe nobody's got great at collecting data or fact checking or doing background research, then the team doesn't really have much functional diversity. And as the project changes over time, that team might not be very resilient to those changes because everybody has basically the same skill set. Same idea here. If we break organisms into functional groups, and so for trees, that might be how tall do they get to be? What's their leaf area like? How drought tolerant are they? Or how much can they tolerate direct sun or shade? A diverse community is one, functionally diverse community is one where the different trees present can fulfill different functional roles. Right? And functional diversity is important because it might predict the ways in which this community will be able to respond to changes over time due to climate change or urbanization or whatever else might happen in the future. Just like a team of diverse people might have a diverse skill set to respond to a changing environment, same is true here. So that's one of the things the students really wanted to measure. Next slide, please. So we did not sample at random. We did not sample forest parcels at random in Robin Creek. We were looking in places where there was significant pieces of forest where we also had access. So this is a map of our primary sampling sites. And one of the first things you should notice compared to the map that you saw previously, this is only the lower parts of the watershed. So the top of our picture here is only going up to Robin 3. We don't have any sampling sites for the forest up in people's yards in Robin 4, water quality site Robin 4. We tried asking around and we just weren't able to get access. All of those sites are private property. So we're looking primarily in the parks and city-owned riparian areas here. Next slide. So for Each of those sites, access to the property was one of the major criteria. We collected this data during our fall semester in September and October. And one of the choices the students had to make was, well, how do we want to characterize functional diversity? What functional traits do we think might be most interesting and important here? So functional diversity isn't something you can just go out and decide to measure like species diversity. You have to make some decisions before you go out. What traits are important? What traits are we most interested in? The students, with our help, ultimately zeroed in on 3 functional traits, which we focused on: a wetness index, which measures how well the tree is able to tolerate wet conditions; drought tolerance, which again, how well it's able to tolerate drought; and then nutrient uptake strategy. Different trees have different ways of taking up nutrients. For example, whether or not those trees have an association with nitrogen fixing bacteria, whether or not those trees have a communal relationship with fungi that helps them take up nutrients. So those were the kind of things we ended up looking at in terms of functional diversity. We could, of course, have chosen dozens of other traits to look at, but these are the ones that we ended up focusing on. Next slide, please. So at each of our 4 sites, we did several techniques: point quarter, line point, and an assay of land use. So point quarter is a very common way of assessing forest tree diversity. We basically selected points and we looked at the closest tree to those points in 4 quarters around the point, and the closest sapling tree that we could find in 4 quarters around those points. This technique has the benefit of being able to collect a large amount of data quickly, and it's a very standard forestry technique. For land use, we basically laid 50-meter transects and looked at whatever land cover there was at points along those transects, so that we could make some generalities about impervious surface, et cetera, near these sites. Next slide, please. So for our data, we looked at species diversity of forest trees, and that we used during a very standard index called a Shannon's Diversity Index, very familiar to ecologists. Shannon's diversity takes into account both the number of different species in the community and their relative abundance, which we call evenness. So this is both the number of different species, and is it really skewed? Is it a monoculture? Do you have 10 species? Do you have 10 species there, but one of them is 95% of what you see? That would be very uneven. So Shannon's diversity measures that. We looked at the tree communities for their overall abundance. And then for functional diversity, we chose a diversity measure called a Rao index, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later. And we looked at our wetness tolerance, drought tolerance, and nutrient uptake. Next slide. I'm not going to show you the data for Shannon's diversity, but all of these sites were relatively low diversity forest sites. So compared to intact riparian forest ecosystems, there weren't as many species, and we tended to be dominated by a few really abundant species at all of these sites. Interestingly, though, the sapling community at each of these sites tended to be a little more diverse than the mature tree community that we see at each of these sites. Next slide, please. Here's an example of some of our data, some of the analyses that our students ran. So for example, this is the site we called Robin 2.5, and we see that black walnut was most abundant. One of the problems we ran into, again, this is a learning experience for students. We think that red mulberry and white mulberry probably were getting confused in the field a little bit. Probably most of those were white mulberries. So the mulberries were the most abundant at the site, followed by black walnut, and then some green ash and other species as well. Next slide, please. Here's an example of saplings. right, from a different site. So we looked at the most abundant species that we found in both mature trees and saplings. And you can see in both of these graphs, the diversity or the abundance drops off pretty quick. We have the first three most abundant species account for most of the diversity at the site, at each of our sites. Next slide. So as we look across our sites, the mulberries are the most abundant across all of these sites, followed by green ash trees, mature green ash trees, and then some riparian silver maples, and then quite a few black walnuts still at the sites. There's a bunch of other trees, but all of them were fairly rare by comparison to these listed ones. All right. So finally, let's take a look at the RAU index, this functional diversity. Go to the next slide, please. So what does RAU index do? RAU index is based on basal area rather than individual tree abundance. So we weren't looking at the number of stems of trees that we found. We were looking at their basal area. So bigger trees, larger trees are going to carry more weight in this index. So what the RAU index was doing for us was saying if we draw any two pieces of wood, essentially, if we draw any two pieces of wood at random out of one of these ecosystems, how likely is it that they belong to different functional groups? That is, if we draw two pieces of wood at random, how likely is it that they have different wetness tolerances or different drought tolerances or different nutrient uptake strategies? And that's what the RAU index is telling us. So if you look at the top table here for mature trees, you see the word low is written in nearly all of these boxes. And that means that we just don't have a lot of functional diversity in wetness index, drought tolerant, or nutrient uptake strategy at most of these sites, right? So it's low. Now, there's an easy way to get confused about this that I hope we can avoid here. Saying that we have a low diversity for wetness index does not mean that the trees we see on this site can't tolerate water, or a low drought tolerance doesn't mean they can't tolerate drought. What's low in this case is the diversity, meaning that most of the trees at the site are very similar to one another in terms of their ability to tolerate wetness, or their ability to tolerate drought, or their nutrient uptake strategy, right? So we don't have a lot of diversity there in terms of functional diversity in the mature trees. If we take a look at the saplings, we see a slightly different picture, right? We see that for wetness index, the diversity of functional groups is still pretty low, but our drought tolerance pops up to high at most of the sites for the saplings, and we have more diversity in nutrient uptake strategy. So at least one hopeful interpretation here is that the functional diversity might be increasing somewhat over time as these saplings move into adult stages, if they're able to move into adult stages. Next slide. So the RAU index then, low for adults and saplings in wetness tolerance, low for adults, high for saplings and drought tolerance, nutrient uptake, low for adults, and higher for saplings with some exceptions, right? Next slide. So what does this tell us? We have this low functional diversity across most of the sites for mature trees and low overall species diversity. That's not all bad news though, because the saplings are a little higher in terms of their functional and species diversity. However, as we kind of look at in detail at the site diversity, it's often related to a single species presence or absence. For example, green ash was often more abundant in the sapling layer than it was as adults. And green ash has a moderate wetness tolerance and a moderate drought tolerance. And so part of the higher diversity in the saplings may be related to the abundance of sapling green ash And then the question the students had, which is, I think, a very reasonable question, if emerald ash borer continues to be a problem, are those saplings going to successfully recruit as adult trees? Next slide, please. The students then wondered about the role the green ash might be playing in these systems and were interested in future monitoring. And they also found some problems at individual sites. For example, at site M2, we found that there were a lot of ornamental trees, things like Chinese elm, various plum cultivars and dogwood cultivars that were likely escaped ornamentals that dominated on the site. We also found a clump of Japanese knotweed at one site, M1, which probably needs to be taken out. One of the exciting things is our ability to pair this kind of data and perceptions about this data with local landowner perceptions, and that's the second part of our talk.
All right, I'm back. So the next part of the talk is quite a dramatic pivot from functional diversity of trees in the riparian zone. So next slide. So one of the other big questions that the students had and that the city of Davenport and partners of Scott County Watersheds had was trying to gain an understanding of the human dimensions of watershed conservation and restoration. And the students were really interested in trying to get a basic understanding of residents' attitudes and perceptions towards the creek and the watershed, and to gain some glimpse as to what are the different factors that are influencing those observed differences in attitudes, like sense of place, which we'll talk about in a moment. So next slide. So, okay, a little background, since some people or a lot of people don't think much about attitudes and perceptions very much. So attitudes and perceptions are just people's beliefs, and they can have both a cognitive rational component, like nitrate levels are high in Robin Creek. And they can also have an emotional component, which is more, I really think this creek is extremely dirty. So they can be composed of both a rational and an emotional component. And it's important to keep in mind when we talk about attitudes that the veracity of those attitudes, so how strongly they're felt, has no relationship between the scientific truth as we think. Someone can feel very strongly nitrate levels are high in the stream, even if nitrate levels actually are not. So it's important to keep that in mind as we talk about attitudes. And attitudes can vary from weak to strong. The strongest attitudes and beliefs tend to be either tied to someone's identity or they're tied to direct experience. If you take an example of gun control, tying it someone's identity is that their family's always had guns, they grew up with them, they're a hunting family, and then the direct experience is they actually had the gun hunting out in the field with their family. Those are going to tend to result in very strong attitudes. And the important thing to keep in mind about perceptions and attitudes is they're very stable. And what that means is that they are very resistant to change. And that can be challenging from a conservation and management perspective. The other thing to keep in mind about attitudes, beliefs, is that contrary to some of our beliefs, they may or may not be related to actual behaviors towards something. So next slide. So why were the students focused on trying to understand perceptions and attitudes? I think that they're vital for trying to tackle any environmental challenge, including trying to conserve and restore urban watersheds. I like to think of this as there's really three different ways we can try to fix problems like watershed health. There's the classic cognitive fix. That's premised on we're going to educate people about watershed health. We're going to change their perceptions and attitudes, and then they're going to behave more responsibly towards that watershed. The second one is the technological fix. We're gonna deal with water quality by putting in bioswales or rain gardens, or we're going to use pervious pavement instead of cement. And the final one is kind of a structural fix. those try to change the circumstances in which someone's making a decision. So for example, a landowner, they might take advantage of a rebate program where they can recover the cost of installing a rain garden, or you can get a tax credit for purchasing an electric vehicle. So you try to change through policy the context in which people are making decisions. All three of these are often used in combination to try to get people to be more conservation minded. And it's important to keep in mind that even with technological and structural fixes, they have to be consistent with prevailing attitudes or they can fail. So, so just keeping in mind how important attitudes are. The students were interested in trying to get some understanding in the watershed. So next slide. So the final intro before I show you some of the data is, if you look at the literature on watersheds and particularly watershed conservation and restoration, there's a growing theme that that for watersheds and to be effective for conservation, there has to be some shared understanding of a sense of place, either through people that they have ownership of property or they have some deep emotional attachment to the land or the landscape in which they live. When you see that deep emotional attachment, so that sense of place, it tends to make a more favorable environment for conservation and restoration to occur. So next slide. So, so the methods the students used, you know, given we only had 14 weeks to work on it, we kind of used a modified interview protocol. So what they did is they semi-randomly selected neighborhoods along the watershed, kind of along our sites where they could hang door hangers with contact information, and they tried to get participants to agree to take place in a very short interview. You know, most of the interviews took less than 15 minutes, and then they used a qualitative approach where they transcribed the interviews, they coded the data, and because we were under the limits of a semester, they really tried to categorize the findings into some common themes to help convey where there were consistencies in attitudes across the people they interviewed, and then places where the attitudes were less consistent. So next slide. So we found it, I will say, you know, and this will come up on the limitations, is it was extremely challenging to get people to engage and participate in these short interviews. Ultimately, they ended up getting 7 residents of the watershed. So we have a pretty small sample size. It's important to keep in mind that they're all homeowners. So they are single family homeowners. So no renters. They tended to be born between 1952 and 1990. So they're on the older side in terms of the demographics. And they had a variety of different occupations. So next slide. So from those, these are the themes that the students were able to identify, you know, in terms of, you know, looking for places where there was some consistency in attitudes across the 7 people, and then also looking for places where there's maybe some disagreement in terms of attitudes. And, you know, there's some broad categories. There's the abundance of nature and activities and wildlife. So this would be attitudes where people value specific ecosystem services that they attributed to the watershed. And values fulfillment is tied closely to that someone may have decided they bought a home on the watershed because they really valued being able to see the wildlife in their backyard. So next slide. Yeah, click through a couple here till we see a graph. One more. There we go. So the other one is regional dependency. And this one was looking at trying to understand people's whether they agreed or disagreed with this statement that the Robin Creek positively impacts our community. And you'll see that, you know, 70% of the people that they were able to interview, they strongly felt that the creek had an overall positive impact on their neighborhood. And really a small amount, only 14%, either didn't agree or disagree. So you see a pretty strong agreement that the creek, regardless of their other attitudes, they felt like it was overall a positive influence on their neighborhoods. Next slide. The next one, we're going to look up at stewardship, which is an interesting one. So next graph will show us another pie chart. So this is a similar on a Likert scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. This is where you see a divergence in attitudes. So this was, we have a responsibility to conserve the watershed, and you'll see 57% agree with that statement, but 43% disagree. So, you know, not near as consistent as an attitude, kind of split down the middle on this one, even though it's a small sample size. So next slide. The final one is landscape degradation. So next slide. And safety concerns. We kind of lump these together. If we go to the next slide, we'll see this. So this is looking at people's agreement or disagreement with the statement that Robin Creek is clean. And what you see is, you know, if you combine the strongly disagree, the red, and the orange disagree, you can see nearly 40, just over 40% of the people felt like it's not clean. We disagree with that statement. You've got about 30% of them that felt like the creek is clean, and then a sizable chunk that don't know one way or another, or don't have a strong attitude towards it. The most commonly mentioned concerns over degradation were litter, so just trash, contamination or pollution, and we'll show you a quote about sewage, safety, and then erosion and flooding were the most common concerns people expressed when they were asked about what do we mean by clean or not clean. So again, similar to the responsibility to conserve, there's kind of a, you know, not really one unified attitude. So next slide. And then the final one, click one more and we'll get, so the final one kind of gets at kind of watershed management. And it looked at, it just asked people to respond to that Robin Creek is well managed. And here again, you see a kind of a divergence of opinion. You've got a sizable chunk, so nearly 40% either strongly disagree or disagree. So they don't believe the creek is currently well managed. And then you only have about 14% that agree that the creek is well managed. And then a pretty sizable amount, nearly 50%, don't have a strong opinion. When the students were focused on this interview question, what they found is a lot of confusion over who was responsible for managing the creek. Is it the city? Is it the landowners with properties adjacent to the creek? There was a lot of confusion there that kind of, I think you see showing up on this slide. So next slide. So here were a couple of concerns just to get a flavor for some of the actual interviews. This is one of the participants that one side of what they call Robin Creek is all filled up. It is sharp edge concrete and broken wire. So getting at some of the degradation of the stream bank. The other one, there's open sewage down there. You don't want to let your children down in there to play. So that's getting at some of the pollution issues some of the participants raised. So next slide. So to wrap up, I think I want to keep in mind that unfortunately, we had a really small sample size, and it's definitely not representative. We tended to have, you know, only people that own their house. They tended to be on the older side. We weren't, so I would highlight this is not like a representative sample of everyone in the watershed. We struggled given the kind constraints to get a broader sample size. I mean, the takeaways I think I would have is there was a pretty consistent attitude or belief that they wanted to have a healthy creek, and that Robin Creek was really overall a positive influence on the neighborhood. So there's definitely something to build on there in terms of watershed conservation and restoration. We did find some inconsistent attitudes about whether people felt like the stream is in good shape or not. So that may be a place where you could do we could do some more public outreach and education. And then we definitely found some inconsistent attitudes towards whether current management is good or bad. So next slide. So to wrap up and step back to sense of place, I think it's important to keep in mind that it's possible to take this information on attitudes and perceptions, and you can translate it into more action on the ground. I think you can use it to build just overall awareness of some of the challenges facing these watersheds, and also that it's not a simple solution sometimes. We can also use this to bring in more diverse sources of knowledge. So we focus mostly on expert knowledge. There are people with local knowledge in the neighborhood that could be brought to bear in terms of protecting these watersheds. Over time, with the right amount of public outreach and communication, you can build motivation for collective action. People really do care about the watersheds, and overall, they feel like it's a positive for their neighborhoods, and hopefully maybe build some opportunities to get people more involved and maybe get more resources to actually do some restoration. It's important to keep in mind that across all, even though we only had 7 interviews, for most of the participants, they had a strong sense of place. They were either tied directly to some of the values they pulled out of living near the watershed, or they really felt it was an anchor and a positive benefit to their neighborhood. When you have that developed sense of place, we're much more likely, if we can find a way to get people to get involved and to stay engaged over time and to take a more active role in watershed management. And then next slide. The last one I want to end with is I just wanted to highlight something. This is from a broader study to end and to think about, some of the other watersheds we're working is, and I know some of the people on the call work in both urban and the agricultural watersheds. Robin Creek is predominantly an urban watershed. There's a little bit of farmland in the far northern parts of the watershed, but this is a big study that was national just to get people to, in terms of thinking about sense of place and identity between rural and urban voters. And if you look at the upper right, there's very little difference. People, when they are asked to respond to, I feel like the area I live in is important for who I am. Both urban and rural voters tend to have a very strong attachment to the natural areas or the environment that they live in. Where you see the differences, and you start to see a little bit in our survey data or the interview data, we just don't have a big enough sample size, is you start to see differences between rural voters and urban and suburban voters in terms of who is responsible for addressing some of these issues. Is it the government, which is the dark blue, or is it the individual, which is the yellow? If you jump down to the second one, you'll see ensuring clean water. There's pretty high level of support both between rural and urban voters, 52 and 62%, for the government taking a big role. And at the same time, that individuals still do have some responsibility towards ensuring clean water. The other one that might be relevant to look at is down about 5, where it says protecting trees and forests. So we looked at the riparian zone, mostly the forest, and you don't see much difference there between urban and rural voters. Both of them feel like there's a role for both the government and for private individuals. So there's some potential there for other watershed work to keep in mind. How do you get people to engage? What are they going to be willing to support in terms of policies to do a better job at conserving and restoring these urban watersheds? And next slide. And with that, I think we've got everything. I saw a link to the full report on the website. So if people have read that, we can answer some questions at this time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael and Kevin. Give some folks some time to put some questions in. It looks like one was already answered. Maybe as we give folks a second to put their questions into here, we'll ask, what are the plans for this upcoming semester? Do tell.
Well, we are still working on plans for the upcoming semester. One of the things that we are working on this summer in preparation for next semester is seeing if we can use inexpensive means to track down places and streams where there might be sewage leakage into local streams. That's an ongoing project, and we've had our ups and downs with it. There are certainly expensive ways to do it. We were hoping to try to find some inexpensive ways that would be useful to the city and beyond. We are almost certainly going to also work on riparian watersheds in fall semester. It's a great project for us. We're likely to be working in Silver Creek, which is another one of the tributaries of Duck.
I saw there's a related question in the chat on, is there a sewer leak near Locust Street that's impacting the watershed? There's certainly something going on between the site 2 and site 3 upstream in the park. It's pretty obvious there's a significant source of organic pollution in that reach. I was looking at the sanitary sewer map. I noticed Amy's on. There is a main sewer line that runs directly under a large reach of that stream. And to go back to Kevin, Dr. Geedy's comment, we're trying to find some ways that are relatively cheap, but accurate to try to pin down the more precise location. I will say it's challenging in these urban watersheds because you have to have access. You know, walking up these streams requires access. You're often in people's backyards. So, but that would be potentially the most likely culprit in there. I will say that some of the snapshot data that's been collected and the data by the city, this site, so site 2 consistently has human fecal coliform levels that are pretty elevated. So there's some hint of that. The trick is trying to narrow down where between site 2 and site 3 the issue is. Will Augie continue to do watersheds in the Quad City? Yeah, Dr. Geedy, I mean, the urban watersheds are great. They're accessible. We can get to them in our labs. You know, we can't drive to Dubuque. We need to stay within, it's nice if we're within 30 minutes of campus, and they provide a host of opportunities for the students, both on the ecological and the human dimensions of these problems. So yeah, we'll keep doing this work for sure.
Awesome, thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions come in, so this is your last call, folks. But if no more come in, I'm going to say thank you again, Michael and Kevin, for your time today, for being flexible with having to reschedule our forum, for all your work you're doing in the watersheds as well. And thank you to all of our participants for tuning in today. Again, this will be shared on our YouTube page, so you can come back and refer to it. And we welcome you to ask us any questions. If you think of them later, we'd be happy to send them on to the right people. So
that's right. Well, hey, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all. I'm sure I'll see you soon.
Sounds good.
Take care, everyone. Have a great day.